There is an area that doesn't get discussed nearly enough after a late ADHD realization. In fact, I've never heard it discussed at all. And that's grief. Not sadness, not regret. Grief. Because when you finally understand what's been happening to you, when you finally realize you weren't lazy, broken, or incapable, something else shows up. And it's heavy. Welcome back. Today we're talking about the grief that follows awareness of ADHD-related demoralization. There was a moment after my insight when everything went quiet. The constant monitoring of my behavior stopped. The chronic overthinking slowed down. The need to prove myself dulled. And in that stillness, a question surfaced. What was all of that for? That's when the grief began. Now I could see it. Not one mistake. Not one missed opportunity, but patterns. Years of adapting. Years of contorting myself to fit the expectations of others. Years of trying to function in systems that quietly punished me because of how my brain worked. This didn't feel like relief. It felt like loss. Grief showed up when I realized how much energy it took just to survive. How much of my life was spent managing myself instead of living. Managing my tone. Managing my emotions. Managing how much of myself was too much in a given space. It showed up in the realization that what looked like personality traits were actually coping strategies. Perfectionism wasn't ambition, it was protection. Avoidance wasn't apathy, it was self-preservation. Keeping my world small wasn't a lack of curiosity, it was safety. And when I saw that clearly, it was devastating. Because I could finally see just how much I carried in every season of my life. I'm finding that one of the hardest parts of this stage is admitting how early it started. How young I was when I learned that mistakes weren't neutral. For me, mistakes weren't just errors. They were exposure. They were confirmation that something was wrong. Instead of learning through trial and error, I learned through adaptation. I learned which parts of myself drew criticism, which behaviors drew silence, which questions made people uncomfortable. And slowly, unconsciously, I adjusted. I became an expert at reading rooms, at anticipating reactions, at deciding when to speak and when to disappear. Those skills kept me safe, but they came at a great cost. Grief has made me realize how much I edited myself, how often I chose silence over conversation, how often I abandoned interests the moment they became too intense, how many versions of myself I left behind because continuing in them felt too painful. Looking back, I can see how often I walked away, not because I lacked ability, but because the emotional cost of staying felt unbearable. Another layer of grief has come from realizing how misunderstood I've been. Not maliciously, not intentionally, but fundamentally. I've begun to see how often my inner experience doesn't translate, how the intensity I feel inside never quite makes sense to others, how the feedback I've received, it's not that big of a deal, or everyone struggles with that, wasn't intended to be cruel, but was still deeply invalidating because it was true for them, but it wasn't true for me. Living with that disconnect for so long made me doubt my own perception. I often wondered if I was exaggerating, if I was weak, if I was imagining the weight of it all. This grief has become a gift because it's helping me see that I'm not wrong. I just experience life differently. This stage feels disorienting. I want to fall back on the old narrative that tells me I just need to try harder, but that keeps falling apart, and nothing new has fully formed yet. I'm doing my best to stop blaming myself, but I'm not yet confident enough to trust myself either. I feel untethered. I'm grieving the version of myself who kept pushing even when it hurt, and I'm grieving the life I imagined I'd have by now. My grief isn't dramatic. It happens in quiet flashes, moments where I realize how much time I spent managing fallout instead of building momentum. But here's something important I've realized. I'm finally allowing myself to feel what I couldn't afford to feel before. Because before now, feeling it would have stopped me completely. So I didn't. I survived instead. And that matters. I've also been grieving my identity. When so much of who I thought I was built around coping, around being the capable one, or the fun one, or the put-together one. It feels unsettling to consider who I am without those defenses. I feel exposed. I feel unsure how to show up without the mask. But I don't feel like I've lost myself. I'm just meeting myself without armor for the first time. If you're in this stage, like I am, please hear this clearly. We are not required to rush through this grief to get to whatever is next. Our instinct is to treat it like we do everything else, to jump to reinvention, optimization, or action. Instead, I'm sitting with it honestly. I'm acknowledging what it's cost me to survive as long as I have without understanding my own brain. I'm naming the exhaustion, mourning the misinterpretations, letting go of the idea that I should have been different. I couldn't have been. I was doing the best I could with incomplete information. My nervous system is finally beginning to feel safe enough to stop bracing itself. And that safety, that pause, is what's allowing me to see that what's on the other side of grief isn't hustle, it's discernment. It's learning where my energy actually belongs. It's choosing environments that don't require self-betrayal. It's beginning to trust myself again, slowly, quietly, without force. If you recognize this in yourself, if this feels raw, tender, or strangely calm and heavy at the same time, you're in good company. We're grieving, and that means something is shifting. I'll be back next time to talk about what's beginning to peek through this grief. Clarity. Until then, give yourself grace. You've been listening to Demoralized with Molly Kellogg-Schmauch.